Dear friends, welcome to our TV show Shalom Israel, a show about the culture, history, religion and life of Israel people. Today we have the privilege to have as guest Mr. Dominic Rubin from Russia. Welcome in our TV show, Mr. Rubin.
Okay, thank you. I'm from the UK as well, but okay.
It's okay. What was the purpose of your visit in Romania?
I was invited to take part in a conference on martyrs, which was organized by Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox clergy. I was one of the speakers. I read a paper, and the conference, of course, is devoted to the very painful subject of victims of communist repression. And the conference was discussing what is a martyr, were some of the victims of the repression martyrs, and various other questions which maybe I'll talk about later.
20 years after perestroika in Russia and the fall of communism in Romania, or more, and is the first conference about martyrs in the Orthodox Church or international conference, as far as you know?
Well, first of all, I should say that I am Russian Orthodox. I do live in Russia, but I'm originally from London, although my grandparents were from Russia. So I speak as a sort of person of mixed belonging. You know, I have lived in Russia for some time, but okay, so as far as I know, in Russia, of course, there were thousands of victims of communism in camps, and perhaps even thousands have been declared martyrs and are remembered by the church. That is the case in Russia. This happened relatively quickly, but it can be a controversial question, and there can even be political aspects to it. Now, as far as Romania is concerned, there were, of course, people of all sorts of different political and religious persuasion who were put in prisons. And the question of, you know, what is a martyr? And the church has to come to a sort of contemplation after a certain amount of time to recognize who those figures were. So it's not a quick process. Different churches move at different paces. And as far as I know, I mean, there is a certain impatience among some believers for the church to give an official recognition of the martyrdom of certain people who died in the prisons. And the church, of course, will. But there's a process of give and take, of, you know, popular feeling, which is not always accurate, and maybe the more mature and sober assessment of the church. But this is very much, you know, a question for the Romanian church and the Romanian people, and I myself learned an enormous amount being at the conference, and certainly felt the pain and trouble, because at the conference there were survivors of the prisons, and we did visit one of the prisons just outside Bucharest. So, yeah, the Russian church is still pondering certain cases. It has canonized many, and the Romanian church, I'm not sure if it's actually sort of canonized as martyrs any yet, but there's a growing library of testimony and witness, which will soon, I believe, culminate in recognition of martyrs.
What was the topic of your message to this conference?
I was invited by a Romanian priest who is well known in Romania, called Father Vasile Mihoc. He has come to Moscow several times and has sort of begun to learn about the Russian church. We became friendly because he is very interested in Jewish-Christian relations. So he invited me to come to this conference. I mean, I feel slightly of an imposter because I'm not Romanian. You know, what can I say about the terrible suffering and so on and so forth? So I was more as a witness. But the question was, what did I talk about? Well, I have to admit that, you know, the concept of martyr is an ambiguous one. Of course, in popular culture, it can simply, in the most sort of gross and simple popular culture, it can mean little more than superhero, or, you know, some sort of cause that I like. Well, I'm a martyr for it. So that's at the sort of more idiotic end of the spectrum. In the more sophisticated end of the spectrum, there is still, you know, a doubt about what is a martyr. Does it always involve death? Does it, you know, of course, it has to involve confession of Christ. But you know, some people who survived murderous attempts are also called martyrs. So, you know, part of the conference was talking about what is a martyr. I came along to the Romanian situation, unfortunately being aware of communist repression, but not knowing half as much as what I now know. But my my worry as a Jewish Christian was to talk about the Holocaust, because 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, and in my own life, this has been a powerful event. And what I talked about in a way which I probably won't have time to expand on here is that the deaths of those 6 million Jews, in a sense, are a witness. And the word martyr, martyros in Greek, means witness. So in some sense, the deaths of 6 million Jews is a witness. And I wanted to think about what kind of witness. And I read my paper, and you know, the question of anti-Semitism in the Christian world, of anti-Semitism in the Orthodox world. Now, I knew that I would disturb some people, and I did. But that's what I wanted to talk about. Are the Jews who died in the Holocaust somehow martyrs? I can't really tell you the answer, but obviously in the sense of being martyrs to Christ, of course not, but in the sense of being, I think we decided through discussion at the conference that Christians can recognize that Jews are signposts on the road to martyrdom. They show something is happening, and that evil something, the persecution of the Jews, that evil is clearly a terrible absence of God in the hearts of men and women. And
it's interesting your approach, because only in the last 7 years or 8 years, Romania recognized the role that plays and the place she had in the Holocaust. Before was or ignoring or denying this role in the Holocaust. But in 2003 was quite a shift, a change in the attitude and recognition of historical truth. And this was a big step in terms of breaking the bondage of lies and that all these years of communism were perpetrated and kept in bondage our people, and also bringing a curse of God upon this land, because recognizing the truth is the first step towards liberty.
Yeah, I mean, yes, recognition of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe is rather different from in Western Europe because of the immediate repression that followed the war.
You have a special relationship with Israel, being a Jew.
Yeah.
We want to understand, because you mentioned that you came to a Christian conference as a Christian, Orthodox believer from Russia. What were the main moments of your spiritual journey as a Jew before to become a Christian?
Yeah, well, I was raised in a Reform Jewish family in London. We went to synagogue, 3 or 4 times a year. I went to a traditional English school, which was Christian, and it was a very official kind of Christianity, which really put me off from Christianity for many years. When I left university, I think one of my deepest reactions was to try and discover Judaism. And this was my birthright. So I moved closer to Orthodox Judaism, and I became fully observant as an Orthodox Jew. This involved one thing was, for example, one of my grandfather's relatives. We found in the house 2 big volumes of Talmud with Hebrew in the middle and a Yiddish commentary. And this was one of my grandfather's ancestors who had written the commentary. And I looked at those books. At that time, I could not read Hebrew. I had a bar mitzvah, but this was with an Israeli woman who was more happy to sort of talk conversational Hebrew and had very rarely been in the synagogue. So I couldn't read the Aramaic and the Hebrew and still less the Yiddish in Rashi script. So these volumes began to fascinate me, and when I went to university, I switched my major from English literature to Hebrew. And another thing which is important to mention in light of the conference is that just before I went to university, I went traveling around Eastern Europe. And I went to Hungary and Poland. I tried to go to Romania, but at this time there was the miners' strike. And the Romanians that I met in Hungary, this is all incidentally, told me not a good idea. So I headed up through the Czechoslovakia, as it was then, to Poland. I went to Krakow. And there I really saw, for the first time, what is a city without Jews. Because the Jewish quarter still has Jewish street names, there were synagogues, and it was quite evidently a Jewish quarter. And there were pictures of Hasidim and stuff on the wall, and I looked at this, and I felt a duty to my ancestors to be a Jew. I mean, it's common among, I think it's common, maybe now that I'm older I can see it as a generational thing. The Holocaust was not talked about in the 50s and 60s, even in the West. But from the late 60s and 70s onwards, people began to take it more seriously for various reasons, some of them political. But me, I mean, maybe a generational thing, it definitely spoke to me. I was part of that time when Hitler killed 6 million Jews. What are you doing about it? I wanted to be a Jew. You
recognize your nation.
Yes. Yeah, and that, how did that express itself? Coming from a sort of very sort of assimilated background, I decided that, you know, I looked at the synagogues, I looked at the menorahs, I looked at the Torah scrolls, I thought, well, obviously I have to be a Jew. And what is a Jew? An Orthodox Jew. I became an Orthodox Jew. Very simple person.
You had a conversion to...
I wouldn't say it was a conversion. I think that comes from a different vocabulary.
But you have been accepted by the Orthodox Jews, even if you was a Reformed Jew?
It doesn't matter. I mean, my mother is Jewish, okay. So I'm halachically 100% Jewish, so no problem.
Okay.
I mean...
but your life changed, anyhow?
You could say that, yes. I mean, of course it changed. Yeah, I became observant. I started keeping kashrut, observing all the holidays, wearing tzitzit, putting on tefillin. You know, I'd been to Israel before. I mean, I had a connection. You know, I went to Israel. I was on a kibbutz. I mean, so yeah, it started. You know.
How many years you observed the Jewish Orthodoxism?
Well, I sort of fast forward button. I did it all very intensively to sort of get to the bottom of it. About 2.5, 3 years. 3 years, but a very sort of significant experience. Yeah.
So what you discovered in these years, in this spiritual
deepness
of Judaism?
I mean, I suppose I was somebody who had a very vague, empty idea of what is God. I mean, mostly, you know, through poetry, nature. You know, I had a sort of enforced Christian education where we read the Bible all the time and went to church all the time. But it's amazing how forced religion can really be like water off a duck's back. It doesn't get into you. So, in becoming Jewish, I mean, I was seeing a life lived for God and becoming an Orthodox Jew.
So you discovered the God of...
devotion to God, a fiery spirituality, a love of God, the beauty of the Jewish religion, the Shabbat, the joy of Simchat Torah, the festivals, the brotherly, sort of community of Orthodox Judaism, and of course the intellectual challenge. I mean, the study of the Talmud, the study of Hasidism, the whole rich tradition, Maimonides, Rashi, Nachmanides, and so on and so forth. So there's a great depth.
So was not enough?
Why did I?
In terms of spiritual hunger.
Well, actually, I think my problem is that I'm too cerebral, in my head. The problem was that, coming from a sort of nothing, and my Reform Judaism was really very superficial. For me, it was all or nothing, and the problem was that at university I studied the Bible according to source-critical methods. For some people, evolution and various things, creates a conflict for religious belief. In my case, being a sort of literary person, the problem of the evolution of the Bible, made it very difficult for me to not switch on a light on Shabbat when I understood that this was a sort of incremental development. Many people solve that problem by becoming conservative Jews because they're so immersed in the Jewish lifestyle that for them it's not really a sort of disturbing discovery. For me, it was a disturbing discovery. I mean, I went into Judaism incredibly quickly, maybe slightly coldly and intellectually unmasked it, and with some sadness had to say goodbye. I did spend the next 10 years reading Jewish philosophers and mostly of kind of conservative Masoreti background who tried to deal with revelation and reason, the canon, authority, and all these things. But somehow that sort of academic approach was lacking the fire that you sort of see in a pre-modern Judaism. So I became, again, distant from it.
Who influenced you in these years to find more about the people of the New Covenant? Or let's say, of the Christians?
About Christianity. Well, I was hostile to Christianity because of my schooling. I don't want to blame my schooling. I mean, I'm not saying that was bad, the Christian schooling. It could have influenced different people in different ways. I mean, to me, it seemed somewhat hypocritical, especially my parents, being Jewish, how could they send me there and sing hymns, and then, it seemed very agnostic. So I didn't get Christianity from the Anglican background. Being aware of the Holocaust, I did sort of see. I mean, when you hear about Christian anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages and in the modern period, that wasn't an attractive thing for me. So how really did I come to Christianity? Is a very good question. I think first of all it was, I always I suppose I wanted to marry Jewish and to carry on the Jewish continuity, that memory. But that's a negative thing, Hitler destroyed 6 million Jews, therefore marry a Jew and be Jewish. It begins to lose its persuasiveness as large amounts of Jews know now. Different people at different times. So I think really the first thing was that, for various personal reasons, which I won't go into, but I encountered a certain amount of suffering in my life, which I don't want to talk about, but it began to be the case that a friend that I'd argued about, who was Catholic, and I had said to them, you and your parents are anti-Semites. Now, they were actually of Indian origin. So this was a slightly absurd accusation. But they did have a crucifix in their house. And somehow seeing that crucifix, and which puts suffering at the heart of human existence. I don't want to exaggerate. I'm in Romania. I looked at prisons today. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a sort of existential suffering. But there it was. Suddenly the crucifix, which had been an object of really contempt for me. And I always used to say, why do you not hang an electric chair around your neck? It seemed that absurd to have an instrument of torture hanging around your neck. And yet, it did actually, towards the end of my 30s, at the end of my 20s, the cross began to have meaning. And it was really the Catholic Church that I'd sort of castigated before, because in England, the Catholic Church is more a church of immigrants. Whatever, Polish, sort of Indian, and so on and so forth. So it really seemed like a universality, working class, poor, the dispossessed. That is how I first saw the cross and Catholicism. And for a moment, I could forget about anti-Semitism. So that was the first sort of witness, if you like. And also, one small thing, a friend of this friend, as a kind of joke, he gave me a little diary with the Virgin Mary on it, a slightly kitsch kind of thing. And I actually found that looking at the Virgin Mary, there was a certain warmth, and it was not really a joke object for me anymore. And I would say that reading literature, Graham Greene, a Catholic convert, wrote several novels, and his characters suffer, and they cannot escape suffering. And that became important for me as well.
So how do you came to realize that Yeshua from Nazareth is the Mashiach of Israel?
Well, I certainly wouldn't have put it in that way. I think I could have been in the position of less hostile to Christianity, but of course being less hostile to Christianity and beginning to understand its symbolism, I did also start reading the New Testament again. I'd scrupulously not read the New Testament for the 15 or 16 years since I'd left school, since it was something that was forced on me. When I started reading it again, I began to be drawn into this, okay? But again, I could have been an admirer of the New Testament, or at least a non-admirer. Then I moved to Russia. I moved to Russia because I finished a doctorate. One part of my life came to an end. I'd always been interested in Dostoevsky and Russian culture, and part of my family and grandparents were from Russia. So I moved to Russia, I thought maybe 6 months or so. And there, a friend of mine at school, a school friend of mine, gave me the name of an Orthodox Christian institute where I could teach English. This was just sort of part of getting to know Russian culture. So I started teaching English there, and after 2 years, I started attending catechetical classes.
In this institute?
At this institute, as well as learning Russian.
What is the name of the institute?
The name of the institute is St. Philaret's Orthodox Christian Institute in Moscow.
As far as I know, it's part of a renewal movement inside of the Orthodox Church in Russia.
Yes. I mean, it depends which listeners are listening. I mean,
I met several people personally from working in this institute.
That's right. It tries to bring to life again some sort of practices of the ancient church. And one of them is the full catechesis, according to the canons. I don't want to be precise here, I can't remember, but according to the canons, there should be at least 9 months or a year of preparation for baptism. And the baptism takes place on Easter Day, as a sort of sign of the resurrection with Christ. Various of these things. And of course in Russia there's the problem that the liturgy for people who are new to the church, being in Slavonic and not being in Russian, is difficult to understand. So there's a big emphasis on understanding the Bible in modern Russian. So yes, that it's part of that movement. It's a brotherhood. There's an emphasis on sort of community and all this. So yeah, I mean, as an English Jew, one key moment was, when I looked at, some of the rituals and practices of the Orthodox Church, and I said to myself, no, that's not for me. If I want ritual, I've got Buckingham Palace and the changing of the guard, and I've always hated ritual, to be honest. And I said this to the priest who was leading it, and he sort of said to me in a very simple way, Russian Orthodoxy is not for Russians. It happens to be in Russia, but it's Christ as expressed in Russia. And I understood that I was looking at the surface. It was not Orthodoxy for Russians, but Orthodoxy in Russia. And the more important aspect was Christ, and so. I think, now looking back, I would say that there's a lot in the spirit of Dostoevsky and of Russian literature, which is part of the expression of Orthodoxy in Russia, which has attracted many people from the West. So I kind of fall into that category as well.
Do you consider that you had a momentum of conversion, or was a process of?
Well, I was baptized.
As an adult?
Yes, of course. I was never baptized.
Okay.
I was Jewish. So I went through the catechesis. I came to the baptismal, in the Orthodox Church, they immerse you fully, and we wear white robes and sing and circle around the baptismal font. And I was waiting in the corner of a small village church in Siberia. And when I understood clearly that, this isn't the conversion experience that you're sort of asking for, but I understood clearly that I'm turning my back on Judaism. And it was a frightening thought.
Was confessing that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah?
Absolutely. Well,
not only.
Yes. Well, that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, and that, God is. I must say that in the catechesis it was very much we read the Old Testament. Now that was something interesting because I had a very good degree from Oxford in biblistics. So for the priest to tell me that I needed to read the Bible, the Old Testament, which he doesn't know in Hebrew and I do, but I did. And the problem is that whole biblical criticism, which turned me away from religious Judaism, because the Bible became a sort of dissected thing of German Protestantism that is all cut up, it actually came together again into a unity. And I read it not as a historical document, but as the living Word of God, with other people on that path. So, I have to say I'm grateful to him for restoring the Word of God to me. And, later we'll probably talk about that sort of crucial moment of crossing over into the church and leaving behind Judaism, if not Jewishness. Yeah.
So in these terms, do you consider that they had an experience of converting from a religion to another religion?
Well, different people like different terminology. There are some people who say that Christianity is not a religion. Theology is the fact that the Logos, the Theos becomes Logos, God becomes the Word, God becomes man. It's the truth, it's not a religion. Religion is a question of binding yourself and man looking for God, whereas Christianity is God looking for man. But to be honest, Judaism is also God looking for man. So you may be able to say that about other religions. So there's a break and there's a continuation.
In the same time.
Yeah, one can talk about this for hours and hours. Of course, a lot of the Jewish spirit and thirst and passion for God can be seen in the church. And the founders of the church, the founder is Jesus Christ, and the disciples are all Jews. And the parting of ways, the old sort of question, when did they become separate religions? You can't say that I was a Buddhist and then I became a Christian. So it's not. You couldn't. Maybe people would like to say pum pum, but not quite.
Considering this, do you develop after this moment of baptism and entering as a full member of the Orthodox Church, not a religion but a personal relationship with Christ?
Yes. God is a person. God is not a thing. The question is not what is God, but who is God. Yes, I talk to God and to Jesus Christ, who is God. So there is a conversation, and it's a developing conversation.
Personal relationship.
Yes. Yeah.
In our viewers belongs to a variety of churches in Romania and Romanian diaspora. Also, because we speak now in English, many other people from the United States and Canada can watch this TV show. It is about this turning back to the roots. You became a Christian, but as Apostle Paul did, he still suffered for his own people. Is this the same suffering, the same desire to help the other ones to understand and to live what you discovered and you live?
Well, I'm not the Apostle Paul. I think there are some people who sort of see the unbaptized self as sinful and has to be cut off. I am Orthodox, but St. Thomas Aquinas expresses a perfectly Orthodox thought, I think, where he says that grace perfects nature. God creates man. He does not then destroy man as if he had made a mistake and has to throw away his creation. No, he builds on that man, with a big M, women as well. So I'm a Jew. What can you do? I learnt. I was an ignorant Jew for most of my life. For 3 years, I was deeply immersed in Judaism, and I still obviously continue to visit Israel, to have Jewish friends, and therefore, there are things that worry me as a Jew. Anti-Semitism. I don't like anti-Semitism. So, that's on 2 levels. Number 1, I don't like anti-Semitism because I don't like people who don't like me. It's pretty natural. Number 2, I think that if the church doesn't like Jews, it also doesn't like itself.
As a philosopher and historian, do you have understanding about this hatred against the Jews?
Understanding of the hatred?
Yeah.
Well, if I can do a brief advertisement, I've just written a book, which you can get on Amazon, where I discuss...
May you say the name of the book for our viewers?
It's called Holy Russia, Sacred Israel. What's it called? Jewish Christian Encounters in Russian Religious Thought. It's a bit of a doorstopper, but anyway. Yes, one of the things that I had to deal with is anti-Semitism in the Russian church. My conclusions are developing, and there's 600 pages for you to go and find out what I think. But basically, I find that once Christians start attacking Jews, it turns out they're sitting on a branch and cutting the branch off, and soon they're going to crash down and break their own heads. So it starts off as good, clean fun, Jew baiting. And it ends up shooting yourself in the foot and creating all sorts of hassles for yourself as well. So don't do it, guys. Of course there are deep and complex aspects to that. And I spoke at the conference about the Holocaust and about hatred of Jews and how this has no place in the Orthodox Church. And yet I can't consider myself some kind of hero because I'm a Jew. I'm just simply defending my patch.
Who will take you for serious?
Well, I think what I'm saying is that I have to, okay, before being a Jew and speaking against anti-Semitism, that's a certain thing. But being an Orthodox Christian, I have to also put myself in the heads of Romanian Orthodox, Russian people, Romanians. And it's my duty to understand
both sides.
Both sides. I don't want to give the impression that, well, it's okay to be an anti-Semite if you really have to let off a bit of steam. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I'm a Jew and a Christian, and I need to understand what other people are talking about and where they're coming from. I mean, I made some comments at the conference, which if I'd been with Jewish readers and listeners, I mean, I was talking about the Iron Guard and Codreanu, and I said some things about him. And there were people who were in prison in Romania who suffered, and some of them died, who were members of the Iron Guard, and who people testify in the camps that they were very humane, decent, upright people with faith in God. And they were repressed by the communists for being in the Iron Guard. Now, as somebody on my own territory, maybe I don't really care about that. That's your problem, you're Romanian. But I think I do have to. I mean, I know I have to care about that. This is extremely important, interesting. It's part of the human story. So now I would like to know more about these people and the history of the prisons. And I talked about Auschwitz, but as a human, as a Christian, as a Jew, I need to know about the suffering of the Romanian people and what happened here. So, yeah, I can't.
It's an interesting story regarding famous Jewish Christian, Richard Wurmbrand.
Yes.
Who suffered for 14 years in prison, and he had communion with these people from Iron Guards. Yeah. So they suffered together for many years in prison.
And Nikolai Steinhardt.
Yes, they still had openness to share and partake the bread and the cup with those who oppressed the Jewish people.
Yeah. So
it seems that God's love overpass
all
the boundaries.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I don't know enough about those stories, but there are very interesting things there. And I mean, in the Russian context, there are many surprising things as well. I mean, to give you an example, Father Sergei Bulgakov is a controversial theologian, yes, but he has influence. I mean, in his case, he was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1922, and he wrote some very horrible things about Jews, because he was actually interrogated by Jewish Bolsheviks, which I don't think excuses it, to be honest, because the idea that all Jews were Bolsheviks is kind of idiotic. Sorry, but he did write things about Jewish Bolsheviks, and he used scriptural language. Of course, we all know there are things which, taken out of context, your father is the devil, and so on in John. I mean, taken out of context and applied to, the Bolsheviks, the Jerusalem Bolsheviks, meaning, the people that crucified Christ, the Russian Bolsheviks, the Russian Jewish Bolsheviks who crucified Russia. I mean, that kind of anachronistic stuff, he did that. But before we sort of say, what an anti-Semite, in 1941, in occupied Paris, occupied by the Germans, he wrote works denouncing Hitler's paganism, defending the Jews as the chosen people, the still chosen people of God, who cannot be replaced, arguing against supersessionism in 1941. and arguing that there must be Jews in the church, which some people don't like, because why should Jews be in the church? But there are other positions. So in other words, as a Jew and now as a Christian, one has to go very deep into flawed human situations and sort of see what is happening there.
As a Christian, what is your understanding right now? You refresh your understanding towards your own nation and how to serve your own nation as a Jew.
Well, I'm a realist. I realize that, having been an Orthodox Jew, I understand that for large amounts of Jews, I am I can't remember what it's called, meshumar, somebody who has broken the covenant, who is no longer a Jew. I can return and repent and become a Jew again for Orthodox. But of course I still have Jewish friends who so far haven't tried to burn me or anything. So there's different levels. I mean, I'm not sure I can anymore speak to anybody except myself and my friends as a Jew. Because, the real situation is that, like it or not, at this time, I don't believe I can immigrate to Israel, especially after this program. Maybe before. But I did live in Israel a year. So my nation, yes, nation for me, but am I that for them? Well, unfortunately, the Jewish nation is divided into many factions. Sinat Chinam. I'm not very good at being a spokesman, to be honest. Anyway, so what do? I write a book. I'll write another book. If people want to read it, please do. But I'm not a spokesman.
In your hearts, you still love your own nation, in spite of the fact that right now you feel like excommunicated because of your new belief.
Yes.
Yeah. You cannot deny the...
Of course not, no.
The source, the origin.
No, it's a very intimate thing that goes through through descent.
There is a serious question regarding the coexistence of the Jewish nation and the Gentiles, and particularly the church.
Yeah.
How we can live together?
Well, there is a break, and there was, the thing which is much discussed, and now it is called the passing of the ways, which took 200 or 300 years, when what is now called Judaism and Christianity, starting from one seed inside of the different Judaisms of the Second Temple period, grew into the two non-connected branches of Judaism and Christianity. Some people believe that there has to be a Messianic Judaism, a Jewish Christianity, which will be the link between them. Maybe we'll discuss that later. I don't believe that. I think the gap is there, and Messianic Judaism will fall in the gap and disappear. But I don't actually condemn it, and I'm becoming more and more open to listening to that voice. I don't have time to develop that. But so the question remains: what other ways for Judaism and Christianity to relate? Well, they are relating. Christians, non-Jewish Christians, which is 99.99%, I suppose, they are interested in the Jews. They have to be. That's where they come from. They come from the Hebrew Bible. You have to learn Hebrew. Well, you don't have to, but it helps to understand what is called in Christianity the Old Testament. So, Christians will always be interested in Jews. Of course, actually, the other way around is not so evident. Jews I suppose what's offensive to Christians is, anti-Semites think that Jews sit around all day talking about, how they can do damage to Christians and Gentiles. But in fact, if you open the door on a Jewish conversation, mostly you just get silence about Christians. So you can stay for a long time eavesdropping and hear nothing. I mean, there are things, but, overwhelmingly it's a bit asymmetrical. So, how can Jews... although I do have to say that, of course, the silence is rather meaningful. It is a meaningful silence. In other words, it's a sort of silence of, we're not talking about you. But that's also becoming less true. After the Holocaust, in the West at least, there's plenty of deep mutual interest and attempts to interact with respect and love. And of course, the meaning of love, it mustn't be a kind of love where I grab you and try and baptize you, which is not love. So hopefully maybe it's just a passing thing. Maybe the alienation will happen again. But at this time, we do live in a period where both Jews and Christians want to know about each other. On the Jewish side, there's Michael Wiskerud, a theologian, who has, made for many Orthodox Jews, outrageous suggestion that, Jews who believe in Christ should keep the Torah because they are still members of the covenant.
We live in a very tense historical times, at least regarding Israel's state.
Yeah.
And it seems that there is a large consensus that a Christian must do something in terms of defending Israel.
Yeah.
At least this time, because the Holocaust happened because of the silence, mainly of the church, of Christian church.
Yeah.
How you perceive it, particularly in Russia, is the Russian Church, Orthodox Church, having a stand on behalf of Israel right now because of this connection with Iran and all this tension in the Middle East?
Well, I suppose Christian Zionism is more a sort of American Protestant thing, and it has a certain political angle. And you're very quickly going to get into some political discussions because usually it's Likud and more right wing that would welcome that attention, and other people, it's a very ambiguous attention. It can become very naive and offensive in the sense that, oh, good, there are lots of wars now. This conflict is really taking off. Apocalypse now. Great, the second coming. It can be very much just simply using the Jews and the Israel-Palestine conflict for rather sort of naively understood doctrines. So that's that. As regards Russia, there have always been sort of traditional thinkers and sort of less traditional thinkers who have been interested in Zionism. Who I quoted before, Sergei Bulgakov, wrote in 1915 an article called Zion. He wrote it for a collection of articles in defense of Russian Jews who are being attacked in pogroms on the western front of the German versus Russian conflict. So it was a sort of articles to defend Russian Jews in the press. And he wrote an article called Zion, which is a Christian Zionist article saying, yes, Zionism is great, the return of the Jews to their homeland and their spiritual regeneration. For spiritual and physical and national regeneration. That was also ambiguous. He quite clearly sort of saw this as, a prelude to conversion to Christ. But that belief in itself doesn't have to be offensive if it's understood in the right way. There are sort of voices like that developing now in the Russian church. And of course, 1 in 5 Israelis is Russian. So there are many Russian Orthodox Jews, again that brings us to the sort of middle thing, but who are sort of creating an identity which I don't think sociologists have yet really investigated, which is a mixture of the Israeli, the Russian, and the Israeli already contains the Russian, and many aspects of Israeli society have deep Russian roots, and as I sometimes slightly frivolously like to say, they therefore also have Orthodox roots. I mean Russian Orthodox. I mean the monasticism, Russian monasticism in the 14th century was about sacred devotion to labor and the land. That's how the Russian state expanded. And the idea of holy labor in Zionism, working the land on the kibbutzim, has certain genetic connections with Russian Orthodox monasticism, whether people know this or want to say it or not. So there are all sorts of, Christianity comes from Judaism to a certain extent. I could qualify that. And all throughout European and Christian history, there's this constant feeding back in and feeding out of Judaism into Christianity and Christianity into Judaism. And, people are doing work on how the interpretation, for example, of the story of Abraham and Isaac was influenced by Jewish interpretation. But now some people are doing work on how the Jewish interpretation, the Midrash, was influenced by early Christian thinking about Isaac as a sacrifice and a sort of precursor of Christ. So, there's a lot of work done on how Judaism influences Christianity. But what I'm saying, especially with the monastic labor and Zionism, is there's also elements where Jews are not isolated from European and Christian culture, but are actually deeply absorbed in it. Of course, there are many figures like that, and I look at some of them in my book. An Orthodox Jew, Steinberg, a philosopher, who creates a Dostoevskian philosophy of Russian all-unity. And yet he's an Orthodox Jew who studies the Talmud and Maimonides. This shouldn't be too surprising anymore. And there are people in Israel, scholars, also investigating the influence of Russian symbolism, for example, on Israeli poets who were born in Russia. So there's, the latest wave of Russian-Jewish interaction, which came from the post-Soviet immigration to Israel. It's another phase in this, deeply rich cultural and spiritual interaction.
Along our discussion, you mentioned several times about this treasure that you discovered in Russian philosophy and history, and that influenced your decision and thinking in the last years. Because our viewers, majority are Christian believers, also Jewish believers. What do you recommend in terms of approaching this treasure of an inheritance of Russian culture and history?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of it hasn't been translated, and it only exists in Russian. So my first advice would be go and learn Russian, which, of course, is not a very good missionary approach. But there has been stuff translated, and to some people it's attractive, to some people it isn't. But and in some respects it's slightly old and outdated, and I think it needs to be updated. For example, Vladimir Solovyov was a philosopher at the end of the 19th century who had many interactions with Jews, studied the Talmud with a Jew, with a Jewish teacher, wrote in the Russian press in defense of the Talmud and in defense of Jewish customs. And when he died in the synagogues, people said a prayer for a righteous Gentile. And another person that I guess I should talk about is Dostoevsky. You can get his books anywhere. I'm always shocked by people who are not moved by Dostoevsky, but it happens. Of course, Dostoevsky was an anti-Semite. But Aaron Steinberg and many Russian Jews of that time, and I believe even in Romania, were attracted to Dostoevsky. Now, how could this be? This is a phenomenon of Jewish attraction to Dostoevsky. To some people, it's a scandal. I don't really want to sort of explain it completely, but I would say that, of course, Dostoevsky's belief in the sort of messianic nature of the Russian nation, which Steinberg saw as very sort of Old Testament and Judaic. That's what he saw in Dostoevsky, a very sort of a belief in the carnality, the incarnational aspects. So Dostoevsky's families in his books, grandfather, uncle, daughter, cousins, they all represent ideas. So ideas are flesh and blood, just like in the genealogies of the Old Testament. This attracted Steinberg. And maybe it's because they're so close that there's that spark and that fire. The Jews used to write to Dostoevsky and say, how could you be so anti-Semitic? He goes, me, anti-Semitic? I have nothing but admiration for the Yids. It's all paradoxical. I mean, paradox is sometimes dangerous, but, you know, Dostoevsky you can find in any good bookshop. The thing that I didn't understand is I was interested in Dostoevsky, you know, he really changed my life in a way when I was 15. And I have to say that I read Crime and Punishment and I missed the Christian aspect completely. I just totally missed it. But it's there, and I think the Russian philosophers bring out all that treasure of Christian Orthodox insight with its deep Jewish carnality, which is in Dostoevsky. They bring that out. And, you know, hopefully those works will be translated at some point. And in my book, I do discuss quite a lot of that aspect, because part of my desire was to sort of translate into English or summarize some of those maybe lesser known aspects of Orthodox Christian belief.
You live in Russian since 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And as far as I learned, you married with a Russian Jewish or?
No. Russian non-Jewish, but yeah, and I have 2 children. And yet I'm.
In terms of this carnality of transfer from one generation to another one.
Yeah.
I have a personal question. What do you teach your children to be?
Well, let's put it this way.
Do you have a son?
The 2 sons.
2 sons.
I'll say this. First of all, my wife is incredibly open to Jewish culture and Judaism. And together, I mean, I keep handing her Yiddish literature, you know, Besheva Singer, Chaim Grade, Der Nister, family mashber. I mean, she's and Israeli literature. So she's turning into a bit of a frightening, knowledgeable person about Israeli and Yiddish literature. And she's read books on Judaism. I did try and drag her to a synagogue at one point, but the synagogue was closed. There is that. My youngest son, we take them to church. Where in Russia there are many Jews in certain Russian churches. And he does enjoy reading Shema Yisrael. And he does have the Ra. In Russian, I mean, he uses Ra, but he says Ra, so his pronunciation of Hebrew is wonderful. And he can read the Shema. I mean, and he actually likes doing that. He takes the Jewish prayer book down and asks me to you know, help him read it. But I mean, I'm not indoctrinating or sort of whatever. I bring him up as a Christian. We pray every night in front of a cross ourselves, and in Russian, and he will be a Russian Orthodox Christian. If he wants to discover his roots and become a Jew, you know, I'm sorry to offend people, but will I be heartbroken? I mean, mysterious are the ways of the Lord.
But you create a frame that he'd grow up in the freedom of knowledge and becoming the man that God decided to be.
Well, I bring him up hopefully in an atmosphere of loving kindness and truth, which for me is Orthodox Christianity. But there is the great unresolved question of the Jewish roots of Christianity. So, and his father is Jewish. So if he wishes to find out about Hebrew, and who knows how the world will change and move on, I don't want to cut that off from him. I have no fear of my past or of Judaism. I have a love for it. So, you know, God should, you know, help him in whichever way.
Mr. Dominic Rubin, thank you very much for being with us in this TV show. We hope that many people will find answers to their own questions and struggling in their spiritual path. Dear friends, thank you for being with us this night in our TV show, Shalom Israel. Until the next time, we wish to all of you Shalom, Shalom Romania, Shalom Russia, and Shalom Israel.